talking about photography tonight, taking pictures of storms. It's something that is a bit of a hobby of mine. I've done it a lot, and I thought it might be something fun to talk about since a lot of people like to take pictures of the storms that they see and other interesting weather things that happen around them. So just a little bit about me as a photographer. I've been doing photography as a hobby since summer of 2013. So we're going on about 8 years now. Originally, it started out just as a way to capture storms. I saw like a mammatus clouds or a shelf cloud, and I just wanted to take a picture of it so I could see it later, share it with my friends and family, whatever. But over the years, it really branched out into more than that, became more of kind of a creative avenue for me, and started taking pictures of other things besides storms. And it's really just kind of snowballed from there. And now it's a big part of what I like to do in my free time. I do it quite a bit these days. I've taken over 6,000 pictures in the last 9 months with just my Sony camera here. That's not including the photos I take on my phone or whatever. That averages out to 22 a day. So, you can do the math there and figure out how many per year and stuff like that. But it's a lot. So I have quite a bit of experience with it, and I've seen quite a few different things as it pertains to photography. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. I'm sure if you, pretty much anyone in this Zoom room, I'm sure if you look at their camera roll, they're going to have photos like this in there. Some phone shots of cool clouds that they saw. Maybe they caught a lightning bolt or something. But they're not trying to do anything super artistic or creative with them. They're just trying to capture the phenomenon that they saw, which is completely fine. That sometimes that's all you really care about. That's what I really only cared about initially. And these are all photos that I took back in 2012, I believe. These were taken with the original iPhone, I believe, the iPhone 1. So that's a bit of a blast from the past. But maybe you want to get a little more artistic with it. You want to kind of sort of express more of the beauty behind the storms and sort of the experience that you feel when you're standing there watching them. That's kind of what really inspired me when I started out, was just trying to capture these moments in these still frames. It's really satisfying when you're able to translate that over to a still image, that experience that we all love of seeing storms. So how can you get better at it? I'm going to talk about a couple of different things tonight. Lighting, which is more because storms present some pretty harsh lighting conditions that can be tough to deal with if you aren't familiar with how cameras work. Composition, that's basically how objects are arranged in your photo. And believe it or not, small changes in the position of elements in your photo can really make or break it and make it look a lot better or a lot worse. I'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques that photographers use to make them look appealing. The storm itself, just the nature of storms, how they quickly evolve, kind of necessitates you needing to be fast when you're taking pictures so you don't miss that perfect moment. And I'll talk a little bit about gear at the end, although as we'll find out later on, it's really not all that important if you know what you're doing. So we're going to start with difficult lighting. So when it comes to cameras, there are really 3 settings that control how a camera exposes an image, how they deal with the light that is impacting its sensor. Those 3 are shutter speed, something called ISO, and then something called aperture. We're going to go through those one by one. So the first one is shutter speed. It's basically the amount of time that you let your camera's sensor collect light. The longer your shutter speed, the brighter your image will be because it's able to collect more light from the scene. However, there is a bit of a trade-off. If you make your shutter speed too long, anything that moves an appreciable amount in that time will be blurred. say you have your camera's shutter open for like 2 seconds and a car drives by, that's going to blur a little bit because obviously in 2 seconds, a car can move pretty far across the frame. When it comes to storms, they don't move that fast. However, they move fast enough that in dark conditions, when you're trying to collect as much light as possible, you need to keep this in mind because you may end up blurring your images a little bit, believe it or not, with how fast some storm clouds move. So the next one is ISO. This is a little bit more technical. Essentially, it's how the camera deals with the sensitivity of the sensor. Higher values make the sensor more sensitive to the light coming in and brightens the image. However, it does that at the cost of making the image more noisy, has a lot more grain. ISO is a holdover from the days of film photography, even though the method is different now for creating noise in digital images as opposed to film. The result is still pretty similar, so the name kind of stuck. Like I said, the big trade-off, the higher your ISO is, the more noisy your image will be. So that's the big thing to keep in mind with ISO. And then moving on to the last setting, your aperture. So between your camera's sensor and its lens is a tiny little pinhole called its aperture. The size of that pinhole determines sort of the sharpness of the image and your depth of field. In other words, how large of a depth you can have in focus at once. The smaller your aperture is, the less light you're able to let in. It's just a smaller hole, so you can't get as much light in, but it brings the image into a sharper focus over a deeper depth. And conversely, if your aperture is open very wide, you're able to let a lot of light in. It'll make your image brighter, but your image can look a little fuzzy in spots, and you can only bring objects at a very specific depth into focus, and anything that's not at that specific depth will look blurry and out of focus. So all of this is really to talk about how you deal with low light situations, because storms are often, in low light situations. They're dark clouds. Occasionally, you'll be taking a picture of a storm at twilight or sunset or something like that, and light is at a premium. You need as much as possible. So, I mean, the ultimate goal for every photographer in a low light situation is to collect as much light as possible while sacrificing as little image quality as possible. So when it comes to storm photography, storm clouds typically move slowly enough that increasing your shutter speed is a good option to get more light. And the motion blur will typically be fairly unnoticeable unless you start getting into those multiple second long exposures. Also, once your exposure gets over like a quarter of a second, it becomes pretty hard to hold it still with just your hand. So you'll probably need a tripod to keep your camera still if your exposures are going into the half-second plus range. A larger aperture, so in other words, making that aperture open up wider, is also generally a decent trade-off to make for low light performance. Landscapes and storms tend to be far enough away that the shallower depth of field does not bring important parts of the image out of focus. You're still able to maintain, you're still able to keep most of the storm in the landscape in focus despite the larger apertures, just because it's all so far away from you. So that basically just leaves ISO. You should really be keeping it as low as is physically possible, because increasing your ISO, it's really the odd man out in terms of the three. If you increase it, your image is going to get pretty noisy. So at all costs, keep it as low as you can while still getting the image as you want. Obviously, if you're taking pictures at night or stuff, you will have to bump the ISO up a bit just to get it to work. But you should always keep in mind getting that ISO as low as possible. And in fact, most modern cameras have something called ISO priority mode, where it'll prioritize keeping the ISO as small as possible and automatically adjust the other settings for you. So all you have to do is just point the camera at the setting, and it'll determine the right balance of settings. And it usually gets you pretty close. But as always, you can just go completely manual and get the settings yourself and give yourself full creative control. The next thing I'm going to talk about in terms of lighting is dynamic range. Sounds like a big word, but it's really just a phrase that describes, you know, how much range of brightness can your camera capture? Because you'll often encounter stormy skies that have areas of very dark clouds, you know, at its base, and then right next to it are bright blue skies. And that range and brightness is really hard for a camera to handle because it can only encode a finite number of brightnesses. So if it exceeds that minimum or maximum value, the pixel will be made pure white or pure black. And at that point, you lose all the detail in the image. It just shows up as a white blob or a black blob. And you don't want that. You want to record detail. You want to see that texture in the storm clouds because that's often one of the most intriguing parts of a stormy scene. So just going into some examples here. This is a storm from in far southwestern Texas back in the 2019 storm chase. You can see here, so in this red box, you can see some pixels here that are pure white. That means they've exceeded their maximum brightness value. You've lost all the detail there. And conversely, you have some purely black pixels up here. What I've done with this image when I took it is I tried to prioritize getting as much detail in this area as possible, these storm clouds. And I was okay with trading off some very bright values here and some very dark values here, because the main focus of the image is this area here in the middle with the lowering cloud base and other parts of the storm, as well as keep getting some detail in the ground as well. So, you know, you really need to consider what part of the image is what you want, you know, your viewer to focus on. And that will help you determine how you can balance the light. You know, what you can allow to be blown out or completely darkened out while still keeping the important parts of the image in detail. Moving on to the second example, it's a similar story here. You have some maxed out values here on the left side, and then you also have some values, some black areas down here, especially in the trees in the house. But again, the main focus of the image, at least in my eyes when I was taking this, was this whale's mouth area here behind the shelf cloud, all that detail in the clouds. That's what I really wanted to capture. So I was okay with having losing some detail in here and over here, because again, this was the main focus of the image. Moving on to the third example, something that you'll often encounter in storm photography is lightning. And lightning's a great example of that dynamic range balance. Lightning will always peak the dynamic range of your camera. It'll always be pure white. And if you try to darken your image to make that lightning bolt less white, you're going to lose all this foreground detail. So, you know, you want to prioritize getting that detail in your foreground and in the clouds behind the lightning. And don't worry about the fact that the lightning is pure white, because you really can't avoid it. And it kind of gives it that glowy look that people like in lightning photos. So yeah, when it comes to lightning, you can actually lean into the fact that your camera has a limited dynamic range and use it to make the image look even cooler. It's an interesting thing. So now we're going to get into composition, how objects in your photo are arranged. The most simple way to accomplish this is to put the subject of your photo or the thing you want the viewer to focus on smack dab in the middle, either in the middle horizontally or in the middle vertically or right in the middle of the frame. It's probably the simplest way that you can put something in a photo. So just first example here, you can see this little barn here at the towards the foreground is right in the middle horizontally. You can also see the origin of the lightning bolt up here is also aligned with the center of the frame. And then example 2, this is a similar story, except the lightning here is near the center of the frame, both horizontally and vertically. It's right in the middle. So it immediately catches your eye as you look at it. Third example here, this one is a little more complicated, I guess. You have the most obvious centered line right here with this barn towards the center of the frame. But then you also have this shelf cloud here that's aligned, that's centered vertically in the frame as well. So you have two different elements of your photo that are aligned in the middle at the same time, but in different ways. So the second thing we're going to talk about with photo composition is the rule of thirds. You may have heard of this before if you've taken an intro photography class or have read up on photography at all. It's one of the most basic techniques that you can use to compose a photo. The general idea is you take your frame and you split it into thirds both ways, and you come up with this grid. So you have these grid lines running up and down, side to side, and then you have these 4 intersection points. And the general idea is aligning elements with these grid lines, and especially at these intersection points, is really pleasing for us to look at for whatever reason. It's just the way things are. So just an example of this in action, we have this photo here. And if we overlay that grid, you can see the foreground here is perfectly aligned with this bottom line here. So foreground is the bottom 2/3, and then the background, the storm itself, is the top 2/3. So that's a pretty simple example there. This will happen quite a bit with landscape photography, especially. You have your foreground take up the bottom third, and then the background take up the top third of your frame. It's something that you'll lean into a lot if you do landscape photography. So second example, this is an example of using one of those grid line intersections to make the photo better. You can see here, if we overlay the grid, the intersection is aligned with this car here. So that, again, that catches your eye. When you look at the photo, your eye kind of just is drawn to this point here with the car. Yeah, nothing much more to it. This one's a little more complicated. We actually have 2 different elements that are aligned with this grid. We have this farm here in the foreground, and then this lowered cloud base here. And if we overlay the grid, you can see this farm is split right down the middle by this line, and then you have this cloud lowering that's split right down the middle by the other vertical line. So you have multiple elements in alignment. Another example here, one more, this rainbow here, you can see where the rainbow intersects the ground. It's aligned with one of these up and down grid lines. And then also just going back to centering, where the rainbow intersects this grid line is actually in the center of the frame. So you have an example of centering as well. Yeah. So last component of composition that I'm going to talk about, this is one that you probably wouldn't hear about unless someone's talking specifically about storms. Part of the experience of chasing a storm and watching a storm is their huge scale. They take up massive swaths of the sky. They cover the horizon from end to end. And as a photographer, you kind of want to capture that feeling that you get when you're standing next to something so huge. There are a couple different ways that you can accomplish that feeling of scale. Probably the easiest way is to include a familiar object in the foreground so that you can have some context for your viewer. For example, if you have a tree in the foreground and then a storm that fills the sky behind it, you can contextualize. I mean, you know how big a tree is, obviously, so you can you can see that the storm is huge compared to that tree. So just a couple examples of this. We're going to go back to this shot of the lightning. We have this barn here. So we talked about it being centered before, but it also acts as a sense of scale for the picture. So you've got this barn here that takes up a small part of the frame. Then you have this huge storm taking up a much larger part of the frame, and it just makes it look that much bigger and impressive. moving on to the second one, um, with this photo here, just going to draw some lines here. These red lines are the power poles. And obviously you can see that these power poles get smaller and smaller as they fade into the horizon. And then we also have these parallel lines here converging off on the horizon as well. All of these sort of subconsciously tell your brain that this storm is really far away. It's way off on the horizon. You can see objects that are rapidly rapidly reduced in size as they go towards the horizon. So your brain already is thinking, all right, this storm, whatever's in the background, is really far away. And then it also sees it's taking up a huge part of the frame. So not only is it really far away, it's taking up a huge part of the frame. So the only way that's possible is if it's absolutely massive. And so that, that's one way that is a really good example actually of making the storm look huge in the frame. You can really get a sense that it is massive. One more example here, just looking at this photo, it's fine, but it kind of looks a little bland. So let's add something to it. Just put a little farm in the foreground. You can see just scrolling between the two, the one with the house in it kind of makes the storm look a little bigger than the one before. It's subtle, but if you're looking out for it, you can kind of tell that things just look a little better when this house is in the foreground here. This original photo, I just photoshopped out the house, by the way. I didn't add an artificial house in. That would be pretty hard. Yeah, so that's going to, oh, one more thing about sense of scale. The zoom on your camera, not the zoom that we're in right now, but the zoom on your camera affects how big, affects how big a scene will feel. The closer you are to an object and the wider you shoot, the larger the scene will feel. And we have this geometry over here. You can see we have a camera that's closer to the subject, but it's shooting wider. So you have this amount in frame here. And then if you have the same amount in frame over here, but you move the camera back, you can see the angle between these two lines here, the edge of the frame, is smaller. You have a larger angle here. And that larger angle is what gives it that wide feel, makes it feel like you're in a large area. And then conversely, when you're zoomed in with this smaller angle between the edges of the frame, it makes the scene feel a little more claustrophobic and smaller. So just sort of an example of this here, we have two vertical shots. One of them was taken really wide, and then another one was taken zoomed in quite a bit. I'll pose it to you guys here. Does anyone have any ideas which one is the zoomed in one? Which one's the image that I zoomed in a bit for? Does anyone have any ideas? All right, that's okay. It's the image on the right. So the one on the right, I zoomed in a little bit. You can tell, this farm here takes up a fairly large portion of the screen. And then you have the storm in the background. Everything just makes it feel a little more cozy and claustrophobic than the one on the left, where we're zoomed out quite a bit. You can see these houses in the background are tiny. It just makes the storm clouds in the background look that much bigger. So I'm actually going to launch a poll now to answer this question. Which of the three compositional techniques that I talked about are being used in this photo here? So I'm going to put it to a poll. That way you guys are forced to answer. All right, so it should be available now if you guys want to take a stab at it. and you can select multiple options on it. So. I'll let it run to 1 minute, and then we'll shut her down. All right. All right, so these are the results. So it looks like most of you said that there was centering and rule of thirds in this image. Not as many of you said sense of scale. It looks like most of you agreed that there wasn't any sense of scale in this image. All right, so we're gonna go over this here. So centering, there is centering in this photo. We have this house here, this tiny house on the horizon, taking up the middle of the frame. That is definitely centering there. We also, I know most of you said that there wasn't a sense of scale, but this tiny house does add a little bit of scale to it. It's this tiny little house, and then you got this huge storm in the background. It looks a lot bigger. So there definitely is some sense of scale here. And then finally, most of you guys said rule of thirds, and that is right. It's aligned with this bird up here, actually. So we have this grid line up here. Oops, that's approximately aligned with this bird up here. So it was actually an example of all three coming together to make that image. So just some final thoughts on composition before we move on. If you guys are wondering, like, if I'm actively thinking about, oh, is this rule of thirds, or is this centered right? No, I don't think about that. It's something that just becomes kind of instinctual when you take a ton of photos over many years. That instinct you can really only build up through practice. It's like any skill in life. Some people are more talented than others, but I truly believe that anyone can become a very good photographer with enough practice. Using some of these skills. Eventually, if you do it enough, it'll just come naturally to you. So now we're going to talk about the storm itself. The appearance of storms can rapidly change. The lighting conditions, the shape of the clouds themselves. You may only have a window of a few minutes, maybe even a few seconds at times, to get the absolute perfect shot where everything is aligned exactly right. Because of that, there's quite a bit of luck involved. Example would be lightning striking in the right part of the frame. I know I showed you the image earlier with the lightning striking down the middle behind that barn. That was very lucky. I obviously couldn't anticipate that the lightning would strike right there. It just so happened that way. You can also get lucky with some good lighting. Perhaps the sun peeks through the clouds at just the right angle to light up the storm in a really intriguing way. Perhaps you have a nice foreground. You have a nice looking farm or a cornfield or something that really adds to the feel of the image. All that stuff is kind of luck based. And if it's luck based, really the only solution is to take lots of pictures. There's no shame in taking a bunch of really bad photos and ending up with a couple good ones. That's what most photographers do. So when you're out shooting storms, you don't have to worry about every shot being perfect. In fact, most of the shots you take, you'll probably end up deleting. It's really about taking a bunch of pictures and maybe getting a little lucky for that perfect shot, and you'll end up with a couple good ones. So I think if there's anything you take away from this, if you want to get into photography, the solution is just go out and take a bunch of pictures and see what works. That's the best way to find out how to get better at this. And just moving on finally to gear. I know a lot of people kind of have this conception that you need the best gear, the latest and greatest, to be a good photographer. Is that the case? No, absolutely not. Some of the best photographers I know that I really look up to use cameras that are like 10 years old by now. And there are some people out there that get the newest cameras, but they don't really know what they're doing. you know, just an example of this image here on this slide. Does anyone want to guess what I took this photo with? This was in 2014, in case anyone was wondering if anyone wants to take a stab at
it. An iPhone 1.
That's a good guess. I did mention it earlier, but it's one step better. It's an iPod Touch that I took this photo with. You know, if you can make an image that looks like this with an iPod Touch, I mean, you can do pretty much anything. So I mean, it just goes to show it's really more about how you frame the shot, how you use the technology you have available to you as best you can. You know, you don't need these fancy DSLRs to get crazy shots. It's honestly better to just learn how to compose a shot, how to deal with the limitations that you have. And then when you do get better gear, you'll be even better for it. So I know a lot of people are into using mobile for photography, just because, you know, everyone has a phone, obviously. And the cameras on phones are getting pretty nice nowadays. Just a few things about about taking pictures with phones. iPhones and pretty much any other smartphone don't allow you to manually change camera settings like ISO, aperture, stuff like that. Luckily, I believe on pretty much every platform that most people use, there are apps out there that allow you to do that. If you want to get into photography with your phone, I'd highly recommend getting one of those. There's some free ones out there. There's some paid ones out there. I'm not exactly sure which are the best, but you can look around at the reviews and whatnot. And just another note about lightning. I know there are a couple apps out there that say they help you take lightning photos with your phones. I've talked to people that have them, and the reviews have not been too glowing. I haven't used them, but people seem to not be very impressed with them. The technique that I used back when I was in middle school with my iPod Touch, I would take slow-mo videos and then take screenshots of those videos. So it's a little scuffed, but it gets the job done. You know, and another thing about using outdated technology is sometimes you got to get creative to get the shots that you want, and that process of coming up with solutions to problems will make you a better photographer when you do get better gear in your hands. So yeah, no shame in starting out your photography journey with your phone. In fact, I think that's how most people start out these days. And then a little bit about image post-processing. I didn't talk about it much today. You could do a whole talk on image editing and post-processing. It's a heavy topic. But the stuff that I use, you can get these on mobile. They're all free. Lightroom, Photoshop Fix, and Photoshop Mix. I use all three pretty frequently to edit my shots that I take off of my camera. You can just search these up. They're available on iOS, Android, probably Google Play or whatever. Yeah, they're pretty good. I like them a lot. So that's going to take us to the end of the presentation. If you guys have any questions about anything I talked about or anything else related to photography, I love talking about photography almost as much as I do storms. You guys know how much I like talking about storms. So if you guys have any questions, anything I talked about, feel free to ask away.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
What weather phenomenon have you not taken a picture of and that you would
Tornado.
like to have a picture of?
Tornado, yeah. I haven't seen a tornado, but if something other than a tornado, probably hail, I think. I haven't really gotten a nice artistic looking shot of hail. Don't get many opportunities, obviously, in Pennsylvania.
Sam, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So how would you take a photo of a storm in maybe like a really hazy environment?
Yeah, that's a good point. Haze really reduces the contrast of your image. It requires quite a bit of post-processing and editing to sort of bring that contrast out. I would say Generally, you want to keep your exposure a little on the lower side if it's hazy. That helps bring the detail out a little more. If you overexpose a hazy scene, it's typically harder to recover the detail than if you slightly underexpose it a little bit. So that's really the best way to deal with it while you're out there in the field. And then once you get back into the editing studio or whatever, there are some things that you can do to sort of alleviate those problems. But yeah, that's a tough situation to deal with.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Sam, I have a question, and I think this is a pretty common question, I'm sure, to others who try and at least post their pictures. So when you're dealing with social media such as Twitter, where they compress your photos a ton, how would you say, or what suggestions would you have for going about that in terms of maintaining the quality of your photos?
Yeah, so shots that you take on phones are typically not the greatest quality. Most of the pictures I take are off of this Sony Alpha mirrorless camera. They take like 8K images or whatever, like most high-end cameras do. If you have a phone shot, I would say, a lot of it comes down to Twitter itself, just how they deal with it. I would say, just try to do as little, like, don't take screenshots of the image or whatever and then try to repost it because you lose quality there. Just try to work with the original file as much as possible. That'll help you preserve the quality. But a lot of it is up to the site, how they decide to compress it. And I think your internet too. I think, if you have bad internet, it'll kind of throttle your quality a little bit to get it posted.
I have another
Anything
question.
Yeah.
How I know it's always difficult to take on a normal phone a picture of the moon, but is it difficult with your camera? Probably not as much.
Yeah, the moon presents a unique challenge because it's a very bright object surrounded by a very dark sky. So there's very high dynamic range. So a lot of the problems with phones is they actually overexpose the moon because they automatically pick the exposure for you. I imagine if you get an app on your phone that lets you manually change the settings, you can tick that exposure down. Really the key, your exposures have to be surprisingly short to get detail in the moon. And also the moon's very far away and small in the sky. So you need to zoom in quite a bit if you actually want to get some detail in there. Even with my camera here, my wide angle lens, it goes to 70 millimeters. Even that, you can just barely make out the detail in the moon. That's how small it is in the sky. I think the common analogy is it's like the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. So it's surprisingly small in the sky. It's very bright compared to the complete darkness around it. So it is a very tough situation to take pictures of. It helps to have a smaller aperture to sort of bring that detail into a better focus, because you need all the sharpness and detail that you can get when you're taking a picture of something, that far away. Yeah, I would say the main thing is phone cameras probably overexpose, just because that's what they think the best settings are. But if you have the ability to change, adjust your exposure, I would say crank the aperture down, get the exposure down quite a bit. That'll help bring out some of the detail in the moon. Great question.
I have another question. So on the iPhone, I recently, well, I guess not recently, a little while back, I found that you could adjust when you're in the camera app, you can adjust the brightness, or I don't know if would that be the exposure. But that's actually helped me a lot to take better photos. But I'm curious as to your opinion on that.
I think it might just be applying a blanket filter on top. So it's not actually changing the sensitivity of the sensor. It's more just adding something. It's basically the equivalent of going in Photoshop, but in real time. As far as I know, there's no way to change the the sensitivity of the camera's sensor itself in real time. So it may be kind of like a hack, kind of a workaround. Obviously I haven't worked with phone photography in a couple years now, so it may things may have progressed a little more than I thought. Yeah, but I would imagine that's more of like a temporary fix than like a fundamental change to the way the camera is capturing light.
Okay, that's interesting. You're probably right. It probably is like a real-time filter.
Yeah, because I know there are other filters that you can put on it, like a black and white filter in real time or whatever. I would imagine it's something like that.